Great pleasure to be here with you all. Great turnout, and I think that speaks to the drawing power of Knoll, but also the drawing power of this extraordinary man, Harry Bertoia, that we're here to discuss. And it's been a wonderful experience for me to be able to plunge into the world of Bertoia, learn a little bit more about him. I think like anybody involved in design and design history, I was well aware of the iconic works that Bertoia had made at Knoll and elsewhere, but it's only through a deeper acquaintance with his work that I think you really get a sense of what we can still learn from him today, which is the title of my talk. So I will be spending the vast majority of my talk on Bertoia himself. But first I just wanted to say a little bit about the museum, partly to make sure that everybody was familiar with it and the program there, but also because there's actually a very interesting connection between the museum and Bertoia, as you will see. So first of all, can I just have hands up? How many people have been to the Museum of Arts and Design since it moved to Columbus Circle? Yes? Okay, that's great, almost all of you. If you haven't been, please do come and visit us. If you have, come and visit us again. We've just opened a great new show on the painter Richard Estes, the father of photorealism. And right at the end of the month, we're opening the first museum exhibition ever done on contemporary mannequin design, featuring the mannequin designer Ralph Pucci here in Manhattan. So two great New York artist designers. And that spectrum, paintings on the one hand, mannequins on the other, perhaps the single most authorized type of fine art, painting, and something that you've never seen in a museum before, but is of course a branch of design. That gives you something of the range that we cover at the museum. We're relatively small, 12,000 square feet of exhibition space, about 4,000 objects in the collection. But we have this extraordinary platform and location right at the corner of the park, as David said. And we also have what I think is one of the most beautiful, relevant missions of any museum anywhere in the world, which is to celebrate the making of things. That is what we are about. That is what we devote our attention to. So whether it is paintings or mannequins or furniture, what we are concerned with above all is the skill, the knowledge, the commitment, the craftsmanship that goes into the making of a great work of art, great work of design. Now, this is not a new mission for the museum. The building is new, opened in Columbus Circle in 2008, but the mission was actually formulated before the museum even existed, and it was formulated by this extraordinary woman called Eileen Osborne Vanderbilt Webb. Hands up again, how many of you have actually heard of Mrs. Webb before? Exactly. I'm on a mission to let people know about this extraordinary visionary person. She was, for my money, one of the great philanthropists, visionary philanthropists of the 20th century working in any area. She not only founded our museum in 1956, but she also founded the American Craft Council, the World Craft Council, the country's first craft store or shop of any ambition, which was called America House, again here in New York City. A school called the School for American Craftsmen, still active at Rochester today, and on and on. She was a woman of incredible personal energy and, as I say, personal vision. And she really made possible all of the things that we now call the craft movement of the post-war years. What she was primarily interested in was the concept of a designer craftsman, which was a phrase that you may have seen used a lot if you've read 50s periodicals on design and craft, including Craft Horizons magazine, by the way, which she also founded. Designer craftsman, meaning a designer who also makes the things that they are going to put into the market. And she was very committed to this idea of craft-based, craft-fueled design. The reason being that she felt that a craftsman's knowledge, an artisanal knowledge base, would infuse an object with a degree of humanity and care and quality that was not possible to achieve through machine manufacture alone. And you're probably already thinking why this is relevant to the story of Harry Bertoia, who was indeed the quintessential designer craftsman, you could say. In fact, the very first exhibition held at the Museum of Contemporary Crafts, that was the founding name of the museum. Later, as you probably know, it was the American Craft Museum and ultimately the Museum of Arts and Design. But when it was founded as the Museum of Contemporary Crafts in this beautiful townhouse located right next to the Museum of Modern Art on the north side of 53rd Street, there was a show called Craftsmanship in a Changing World, which I still think could be the motto of the museum today. And right there in the middle of this exhibition was this Harry Bertoia, which I now see looks almost exactly like that one that's sitting on the desk there. So we have indeed great resonance going on this evening. So this Bertoia was included as a handcrafted sculpture that also drew from the language and logic of design. So Bertoia was everything all at once for people like Webb and her supporters in her circle that were looking for people that exemplified not only aesthetic sensibility, but also the know-how and the conviction that fuels that sensibility, not just the ability to think about design, meditate on form, envision what the future might look like, but actually to deliver it with their hands. And here is Bertoia doing just that in his characteristic gear of pipe and goggles and hat, and using one of his most important tools, many tools that he had mastered over the course of his career, but one of the most important for him being the acetylene torch, which was one of many industrial processes and materials that he incorporated into his practice over the course of his long career. But let me start at the beginning. For those of you that don't know the story of Harry's biography, it is indeed a fascinating one. He was born not in America, but in Italy. He was born as Arietto. And here you see him with his mother and siblings. He's the fellow on the left. And together with his older brother, he moved. He's age 8 in this picture. And pretty shortly thereafter, still as a young man, he moved to Detroit, where he first studied at the Detroit Society of Arts and Crafts, what is now called the College of Creative Studies, CCS, in Detroit, and then also at Cass Technical High School, which you see here. This building, unfortunately, one of the many glorious old ladies of Detroit that has not been preserved. This building, I believe, was destroyed in 2011, but was a very important center for the creation of new talent in Detroit, fueling not only the car industry, but also the other industries of Detroit today. And it's a very interesting, I'll just say parenthetically, a very interesting backdrop to the contemporary story of Detroit, which of course is very much at the forefront of our minds because this city has become something like a template for the question of whether makers and industry can take a city that's economically shattered and lead it back into prosperity. This moment, when Detroit was one of the most rapidly expanding cities in the country, was absolutely fueled by technical know-how and creative impetus. And it was institutions like the Arts and Crafts School and like Cass that were really fueling this. Here, as another curiosity, is the award-winning drawing that Bertoia made when he graduated from Cass, and you see he's 20 years old at this point, and very skilled in this rather Thomas Hart Benton style regional form of rendering. So you can see he already has quite a lot of hand skills at this point. And again, as you'll see, drawing becomes and remains important to him throughout the course of his career. So this is 1936, and then he goes on to Cranbrook. And here you see Cranbrook. This is a photograph taken in 1940 when Bertoia was here. I'm sure all of you know Cranbrook, the great institution to the northwest of the city, just up Woodward Avenue, founded essentially by a kind of congregation or intersection of American philanthropy personified by George Booth and Scandinavian talent personified most of all by Eliel Saarinen, but also many others that came to the school in the 1930s. So Bertoia goes to Cranbrook. He soon becomes what at the Bauhaus, I suppose, would have been called the master of the metalwork department. So he's the lead instructor in the metalwork department. Here you see him teaching, torch in hand, and there are some of the pieces that he made while at Cranbrook. So again, rapidly assimilating these different techniques and materials. And he starts working, I think, creatively. You know, certainly there's a kind of interest to some of these works that you see on the right, which perhaps suggests something of Russell Wright at that period. But it's really in jewelry that he starts making his first inroads into what will become a signature aesthetic. And this piece, which may very well remind you of the work of Alexander Calder, is indeed a work of Bertoia's. And I think it suggests something of the qualities that will animate his work, literally and figuratively, for the remainder of his career. It's really about line first and foremost, which is one of the key ideas, I think, in understanding Bertoia's work. And it's also about the idea of bringing a line alive through some kind of compositional technique. So here, literally creating a kind of anthropomorphic shape, and a very jubilant one at that, but also thinking about the varying of the weight of the line. So notice how each line tapers very gently, and the transitions are very carefully considered. And so it's not as if every element of this assemblage is given a kind of equal weight or equal treatment. It's very nuanced, very varied. So if you like, it already has this concept of variation across serial production, which is going to be crucial in the years that Bertoia works at Knoll. So again, it's this idea of numerous elements, each of which is infused with an individual character through a hand-crafted production process. Here's another example of that. Beautiful necklace made at Cranbrook in 1940. And again, you see here how he's working with, in a repetitious fashion, multiple elements that echo one another, but no two of which are the same. And I think, again, this is worth emphasizing. He's exploiting the possibilities of hand manufacture to create a particular kind of modernist object. So whereas the sort of modernism that might have been more prevalent in Europe at this time would have more fully embraced a machine aesthetic and would have been more, let's say, rigorous, might be a good word to use. What Bertoia is doing, at least to me, is more humanist. So it's more inflected. Each element of the design is given a kind of almost whimsical, but certainly not frivolous or trivial quality, which can only be achieved through absolute mastery of hand skills. And that's really what you're looking at that's exemplified in works of jewelry like this. Of course, the other thing that Bertoia is doing, which I've already implied, is that he's thinking horizontally, laterally, across multiple media or genres of production at the same time. So here, for example, is a monoprint made exactly the same year as that piece of jewelry I just showed you, 1940, again at Cranbrook. And you see forms here sort of lurking in the extraordinary texture that he achieves through, again, a rather masterfully printed image that echo the forms that he's using in his jewelry. And this, again, is something that will continue happening for him. He'll take an idea, a motif, an image, and he'll move it across from a 2D context into a 3D context, from a fine art context into a design context, from one material or medium into another. And he has absolutely extraordinary elasticity of mind to be able to do this. Here, again, I think it's worth pausing and saying, what can we learn from Harry Bertoia? One of the things we can learn is precisely this ability to move laterally, move sideways across the whole range of potential production. I've already said that's really an important idea for us at MAD, the idea that we can move from paintings to sculpture to furniture to mannequins, and ask essentially the same questions about each of those different genres. How was it made? Who made it? Why was it made? What skills were necessary to realize this object? Bertoia is doing something very similar, asking a very tightly conceived set of questions about line, about repetition of form. Look, for example, at the repeated sort of necklace forms at the left here, how again he's echoing the forms one after another, but again varying them. So how can you create rhythm across that sort of repetition? Thinking about texture and thinking about the place of line within an overall composition through the weight of the line, through the swerve, and again through that kind of internal echoing.
This is a monoprint?
This is a monoprint, exactly. Of course, Bertoia is mainly known, I guess the reason we're all here at Knoll in terms of design, as a furniture maker. His jewelry is fascinating and extremely important, but probably not nearly as well known as his furniture. And I was fascinated to discover, I hadn't actually seen this before, but this was his first extant chair design, again from 1940, the same year, so Cranbrook. And you can see here, it's the simplest kind of construction you can imagine. It's just two cut-out pieces of wood and then dowels moving across to form the seat and the back. I can't imagine it would have been that comfortable, so maybe points off for comfort. But certainly, if you're thinking about Bertoia's intuitive approach to furniture, here again at the very outset of his career, He's already thinking about how to draw a line in space, something that will remain important for him. He's already thinking about linear elements that make up the functional form and planes of the object. So the way that he executes that curve through a repetition of horizontal dowels, for example, not miles conceptually off what he does in the diamond chair years later. It's rather interesting to see that. And also the use of a single material in just a couple of very simple different applications to create a very satisfying, unified, and unique design. So I think you all know the story about what happens next. Bertoia goes to Los Angeles to join up with Charles and Ray Eames, who have, of course, already been involved in the production of these chair designs. Charles Eames working with Eero Saarinen, Eliel Saarinen's son, at Cranbrook to create this famous chair that was shown at MoMA, and it is, in essence, kicked off the enthusiasm for the idea of a plywood shell chair. So here you see Bertoia. I think you see him there just to the right, inside this plywood shell. I think that's probably Ray Eames standing right in front of him. You can't see her very well, but she's right in front of Bertoia, and there Charles Eames on the left. And they are in the process, and this is a story I'm sure you all know, they're in the process of experimenting with plywood, initially using what they wonderfully call their Kazam machine, pressing plywood into forms, and then getting involved with military contracts, creating splints, and other objects for military use during the war. Again, a story that I'm sure you all know well. What most of you probably know, but if you don't know is really interesting to find out, is that the Eames chair is actually made with absolutely critical support from Bertoia in terms of the initial conceptualization. And Bertoia is on record as saying that he was thinking about the traditional barber's chair when he started to develop the sort of prototypes that eventually became the Eames chair, the famous Eames chair. And here what he's thinking about in particular is the separate massing of the headrest and the back and the seat and the foot of the chair, and how each of these is individually mounted and then can be moved relative to one another in order to fit the body perfectly. And this becomes a way for him to think about how these new plywood shells that are curved in multiple axes can be mounted on a metal framework to create what will eventually become the Eames chair. So that's obviously a crucial, fundamental idea or concept that feeds into this most iconic of designs. Unfortunately for Bertoia, Charles Eames in particular is not particularly interested in sharing authorship or agency or credit for this idea. And that extended, by the way, also to his wife, Ray Eames, which is maybe even a more notorious instance. But it also applied to Bertoia, and he was, I think it's fair to say, heartbroken and certainly extremely angry that when this chair was put out into the world, Bertoia's name was not attached to it as part of the design team, and it became the Eames chair, as indeed we call it to this day. Whereas in fact it was a collaboration between not just Bertoia and the Eameses, but also the other people that were working in the studio there. And as I say, this becomes a great disappointment to him and something that he would continue talking about in future years. However, it spurred him to make a move that became critical, which of course was the move to Knoll. There you see that sculpture, or at least one like it. Again, this is Hans Knoll, of course, and here's Florence Knoll, shown in 1956. Wonderful picture of her. And together, Hans and Florence have formed what turns out to be the absolutely perfect context for Harry Bertoia to flourish, a place that has very strong alliances with modern design, both American and European, but also a place where rigorous systematic design is not necessarily the ethos. So Bertoia is given room to play at Knoll. His contracts are written in such a way that he has a lot of creative freedom. He's not necessarily given a commission or a specific project that he's meant to execute. Rather, he's invited to Knoll, chiefly by Florence, and given him this kind of creative license. And what, of course, emerges from this is this wonderful series of furniture that comes to be the iconic representation of both his creativity and one of the iconic representations of Knoll as a company. So how did this happen? Well, one of the things that I'm interested in the story of the diamond chair and its related forms is the fact that it's actually the product of what you might call austerity thinking. And I say that somewhat advisedly. Obviously, true austerity production is something you would think about as 10 years earlier, during, and in the immediate aftermath of World War II. But I think it's important to stress that certainly compared to today, Bertoia is not walking into a hugely highly capitalized modern industrial production scenario. He's walking into a situation that definitely does have capacity, and probably has quite a lot of capacity compared to a lot of other furniture manufacturing in America at this date, but certainly efficiency and ingenuity with a relatively small number of materials and processes is key, because he can't just do what Apple does nowadays, and if he decides that he wants to create a titanium body computer, just buy 100,000 CNC machines that are capable of drilling out titanium. That's not on the cards. So he has to do something that's relatively, as I say, efficient. And what he says is, when you don't have much equipment, you find that wire is a pretty convenient piece of material. Of course, wire is also perfect for him because he is at heart a draftsman, as I've already said. He thinks about line first and foremost. He's, in a way, a two-dimensional thinker leading into three dimensions in some ways. And wire is like a line that can be drawn in space. He also, and this is beautifully evoked by the film over here, if you haven't seen it, do take a look at it, because it's fascinating to actually watch this happening before your eyes. He realizes that wire can be used to make a very complex curved form, just like the plywood forms that he was making out in California, but with even steeper curves and more dynamic forms, because each element of it can be individually crafted to compound into the overall shape. So if you think about it, every one of the wires in one of these chairs is different from every other wire. But it can be made very quickly through simply being bent on jig and then assembled on another jig. Bertoia, by the way, was involved in the creation and handcrafting of the jigs themselves. So this is like a two-stage craft process. First making the tools that are going to make the chair, and then actually making the chair using those tools. So very, very craft intensive, but also mass production. So it's craft production in series, which sounds like a remarkable leap of insight and intuition, and in some ways it is. I think it has a lot to do with Bertoia's training, with his sort of whole approach to design being the work of a trained metallurgist, metalsmith, and, as I say, a hand draftsman artist. But of course, let's not forget that this is the way that furniture was made throughout almost all of human history. An 18th century chair was made exactly in this way, with each piece of, constituent element of every chair being made in series by hand. And so what Bertoia is doing here really is going back to the oldest playbook when it comes to furniture, but he's completely reinventing it through the use of modern materials, particularly this metal wire. So here you just see a couple of more archival shots of the factory during this early stage of production, the undercarriage there being assembled on the left, and then the conveyor, which is moving one of the shells around for finishing. Another thing which I was absolutely fascinated to discover while researching for this talk, was that Bertoia also considered this painting to be one of the most important antecedents for his work in furniture design. And this, of course, is Duchamp's Nude Descending a Staircase, which created a stir when shown at the Armory show here in New York City in 1913. And Bertoia didn't say very much about this, so I think we need to intuit to some extent what he's getting out of this image. To me, it's probably the fact that he's both capturing motion, Duchamp that is both capturing motion in this image, this sort of seriality of it. Again, as I've already said, Bertoia is fascinated by this idea of repetition and capturing multiple moments, but also the fact that the image as a whole, as a static thing, a single composition, has this wonderful interplay of lines where you do have this internal echo, which again is very similar to what Bertoia is doing in both his two-dimensional work. This is another monotype dated to 1940s to 50s, not sure exactly when it was produced, or his sculpture. This is from 1953, brass-coated steel wire. And here you can see the very, very close linkage between what he's doing in his furniture design and his sculpture. Again, this lateral movement. And I think it is very, very interesting to think about a sculpture like this or the diamond chair as being like the Duchamp painting, but perhaps you have to walk around it. You can't do it with a slide, but perhaps you have to walk around a sculpture like this or around one of these chairs to get the effect that he was after, that he was thinking about with reference to Duchamp. Another thing that I think is unavoidable in a discussion of the diamond chair, in which I think is a little harder to say what Bertoia's attitude towards this was the simple fact of its iconic status, particularly once it gained ground and started to become one of the representative forms of Knoll furniture. The reason that it is iconic, here you see a technical drawing. This is a plan of one of the diamond chairs, two elevations of the so-called swan chair, high back chair. And here you see the chair itself. And I'm just going to toggle between these, is the speed and effectiveness with which the design actually does shift between 2 dimensions and 3 dimensions. It's not quite that it doesn't lose anything when you put it into this more schematic form, but something about its essence is preserved in a way that most furniture is not. So this is literally a line in space, but it also reverts into being an actual line on a piece of paper very readily, which I think accounts for some of its quality as an icon. In fact, even more than an Eames chair with the plywood curved seat and back, for my money, this chair is much more effective as a piece of graphic design once it is photographed and then put into a poster or a publication, brochure, what have you. And just as an example of that, here you see this is rather wonderful, again from the Knoll archives. You see this, this sketch for an advertisement photograph. This is what we're going to do, and here's the actual photograph. And you see how incredibly resolved and realized that sketch is when actually turned into a real image. And again, how well it lives up to the idea embodied by the sketch. So this chair to me is like graphic design waiting to happen. You almost can't get a bad shot of it, no matter what direction you take a photograph from. And here I'm just showing you a couple of other Knoll advertisements which exploit this quality of this sort of incipient or potential graphic quality of the chair. This one rather wonderful with these workers, maybe painters, that have been photoshopped in this very Bauhausian way, very evocative of Herbert Motter or one of the other graphic designers working there. And here a rather different, maybe more Mad Men-esque image of the chair with the beautiful idea of a reflection captured in a shining floor, but again, really pointing to the quality of two-dimensionality that this three-dimensional form has when it's rendered into a flat image. The other thing, of course, one has to say about the iconic quality of this design is that it, as I said, becomes an icon of Bertoia himself, and in this respect, it becomes emblematic, along with a few other chairs, of the designers themselves. So here's, of course, George Nelson, Edward Wormley, Eero Saarinen with his womb chair, which similarly performed for him. There's Bertoia in a yellow diamond chair, Eames, and Jens Riesum. I think you could say that perhaps in this photograph, only Saarinen and Bertoia and Eames have the chair that seems to embody them as a person. It's almost like the chair becomes like a brand or a corporate logo for the designer in a very, very interesting way, which I think is really new at this point, with possible exceptions like maybe the Breuer tubular steel chair. I think the identification of a designer with a specific design is new, and it's highly powerful and effective. Eames, of course, continues to exploit it and indeed to develop other chairs like the lounge chair a little bit later on that do this for him. But it seems to me like this graphic potential that I've been talking about, this iconic potential, serves as a kind of communication device that really does change the nature of what it is to be an industrial designer at this stage. And this, by the way, is a photograph published in Playboy in 1961, which gives you a sense of the proliferation and indeed the mass consumption of this kind of imagery. Of course, all white men back in those days, one hastens to point out, and no mention of Ray Eames anywhere in sight. Okay, so a lot being achieved then on the basis of what is essentially a handcraft production process. What is also going on the side, and this is the amazing thing about Bertoia, because you would have thought this was enough for anybody to be achieving, is that he is also becoming one of the most successful and astounding public sculptors of the 20th century, right as he's doing all of this design work and other commission work. So here you see his first major architectural commission, which came through Eero Saarinen, again, the Cranbrook connections paying off. And this was for the General Motors Technical Center in Warren, in Michigan. What's, I think, really interesting to focus on in this particular project, which again he's going to continue to use in some other projects that I'll show you, is that he's using this idea of repetition now to scale up. So it's the same idea that you saw him using in his jewelry in 1940, taking an individual element and making it over and over and over again, varying it each time. But now he's exploiting this not for mass production potential, as in the wire chairs, but rather to fill space, to create a kind of dominant monumental sculpture. So in his own words, talking about this particular sculpture, although it appeared big, I was working on my own on a small scale, doing small things. And I think there you get something of the modesty of Bertoia, which is quite different from some of those other designers that I just showed you, but also, again, something very true about his production process. Everything he does is essentially studio-based and studio in scale, and he wants to keep it that way because that is the pleasure of it for him. That is also the aesthetic control that he wants to be able to exert. So some other examples of this, Manufacturers Trust, just the next year, 1954, here in New York City. This is a building designed by Gordon Bunshaft. And here you see the sculpture as it appears in the Joe Fresh store today with mannequins, by the way, by Ralph Pucci standing in front of it. So there's another little tie-in to our forthcoming project. Here, another project from Manufacturers Hanover Trust in New York City, 1954. This is a ceiling sculpture, and this is, again, just to remind you of the way that he uses linear elements now to fill space and, again, scale up. And then finally, another aspect of his career, which some of you may know about, is his work with sound sculpture, these pieces that he called sonambients. And here you see him in his studio surrounded by these extraordinary columnar sculptures. This is a great example, I think, of how Bertoia thinks, not only because, again, it is this repetition of lines in space, again, the same idea, now applied to a different concept, which is to create these kind of chimes, upright chimes, but also because of the way that he thought about this. He had a chance encounter with the sonic qualities of the wires that he was manipulating in his other work, and he just kept hearing them kind of clang together and make these little ringing sounds. And he realized that actually that was a totally new sensory axis that he could explore. So he'd been doing texture, he'd been doing line, he'd been doing massing, he'd been doing all of these visual compositions, but he realized that he could also compose in sound. And by the way, this is a very strong, a second strong point of connection that he has with Alexander Calder. And this is a bit sad because we never get to experience Alexander Calder's work in this way, but many of Calder's mobiles were actually intended to be spun so that they would collide with one another, and they ring like bells. I had the great pleasure of going to the Calder Foundation recently and hearing one of the Calder sculptures played like a musical instrument, and it's absolutely beautiful because it creates immediately and instantaneously a random musical composition for you with all of these different notes. And it's mesmerizing because you have these sculptural elements turning, and you kind of lean forward, and then two of the rings will hit together with this beautiful ringing sound. And this is the same effect that Bertoia was able to create through his somnambients, a kind of music that was totally unpredictable, effectively chance operations music, as you would find in the work of John Cage right at this time, but expressed through the language of modern sculpture, modern design. Rather wonderfully, Bertoia actually released 11 vinyl LPs with recordings of the somnambients, real rarities. I gather a cache of these records was discovered recently, and so they're now available, and you can actually hear some of the sounds online, which is wonderful. And he said something so great about them, which is that after he was finished assembling them, and again he would assemble these things in a jig, just like his furniture. When the framework was removed, and for the first time he heard the sound, it's almost like hearing the cry of a newborn baby, because each one was totally different, and he had sort of given birth or given life to this thing that didn't exist before. So in a way, there you have Harry Bertoia, extraordinary genius of many, many parts, multiple forms of innovation, and extraordinarily creative, and to us, I think, almost miraculous in his range of creativity. But what I think is so fascinating is that he actually only has one or two ideas, which is the great thing about him. It shows that if you focus on a couple of things that you really, really master, the use of line, the control of certain specific materials and tools, you can go anywhere, which is the real lesson that I, in effect, think that Bertoia bequeaths to us. So to quote him again, I don't care too much as far as classification goes. I don't think I fitted into a specific mode anyway, and if I became aware that I had, if I become aware that I'm pushed into one, I'll burst out of it as soon as possible. So this kind of restlessness, almost like a straining at any creative bonds that might hold him, pushing against the fetters. But to me, what actually enables him to do that, and here the line is a beautiful metaphor, is that he's almost pulling himself out of any rigid classification through the use of these very simple, repeatable concepts. So very much a modernist at heart. So whether it is sculpture, 1958, or drawing, I've been showing you mostly prints, but here's a drawing from the 1950s. Architectural commissions, here are some ambient sculptures installed in a reflecting pool of the Standard Oil building in Chicago, 1974. This building, by the way, a project by Edward Durrell Stone, perhaps a familiar name to you because he designed the original building, the Huntington Hartford that stood at Columbus Circle. Or, of course, his jewelry, this from the 1940s again. You see that there's a set of basic modular elements that he's able to transplant and move, again, from one medium to another, one application to another, different scales, different materials, different tools, but always speaking of the same essential creative spirit. And of course, for me, being the director of a museum that's fundamentally about making things and making things well, the fact that he stood right in the middle of it and made it himself, incredibly inspiring. So that's what I have to say. Thank you very much for listening. I'm probably one of the less expert people in the room to speak about the specific history of the production, but it's the factory's in Pennsylvania, and Bertoia is as well. So this is a shot taken in his barn studio, which is also in Pennsylvania. So he moves with his wife to Pennsylvania to be near the Knoll factory, and he's able to go on site and work with them. Yeah, but the display of the furniture and also many of the public sculptures that he makes is here in New York City and of course elsewhere. You know, his public sculptures happening all around the country, major ones in Texas as well, which I didn't show you, for example. The somnambients have been widely exhibited, so there was just Wright Auction Gallery just had a display of his sculptures that I think included some somnambients, so I'm right. And you'll see them in museum collections elsewhere, including MoMA.
Was it a gallery contemporary with his producing them who was showing them?
That's a great question. Gallery display in the 50s?
He did have a couple of shows, I know.
He did, okay, yeah.
But
Here in New York.
Here in New York.
But do you know the
Because
gallery?
we have the catalogs in our archive.
All right, I'll take a look,
Yeah.
thanks.
Every year you see them at Phillips auction.
Yeah, absolutely. well, all the auction houses. I mean, he was quite prolific, not only in the somnambients, but also the other sculptures. So again, it's something about his it's like he composes in order to be prolific, which is the fascinating thing. It's not just that he works hard, because lots of people work hard, but he's able to work hard in a way that allows him to create these large batches of work, and you see the result of that in the secondary market today. I can't actually think of an instance where he did do that. He worked with architects, as I've mentioned, and I think he's very productive in that context. Sort of, you give me the space, like how big is your wall? I don't know if you count that as a collaboration, but in all seriousness, I think he's really adept at creating a positive dialogue with an architectural surrounding. And I think he does exactly what Mrs. Webb said a designer craftsman should be able to do, which is humanize an environment. So he could take a very rigid modernist box that had a lot of rigor, and he could put the heart into it. And I think that was a kind of magic of his collaborative process. That's how he approached it. But I can't think of an instance where he created another industrial design object in collaboration. Maybe the Eames experience put him off that. You know, it's a little bit like Calder. He continues doing it, I think, avocationally almost. So it's not something that he does nearly to the scale or level of his other activities, even in comparison to his sculpture.
Recognition of it?
They're included in shows. You know, in fact, our museum displayed them. There is actually a show at Cranbrook this year about Bertoia's jewelry, by the way. And so I believe they've done a fair amount of research, and I'm looking forward to seeing that later this year. So those of you who are interested in that particular topic should keep an eye out for that. But no, it's a studio practice, which, by the way, is not at all unusual for jewelers of this time. It is the height of the studio craft movement. And so that work was received alongside work by other jewelers like Margaret Depata and Claire Falkenstein and others. So in a way, there's nothing unusual about it. It's really the context of his broader practice that's unusual. But I don't believe that he actually mass produces. He doesn't do any jewelry design for mass production, as indeed Depata did, for example. Yeah, they're projects of passion and also probably compositional studies. And I get the feeling that this was a guy who wanted to keep his hands busy. So I think there's some of that too. And of course, jewelry is wonderful for that. Talk to any jeweler. It's a great medium for creating rapid maquettes, form studies. I mean, I compared him to John Cage, but I think that's a distant resonance, if you'll pardon the pun. I think of Bertoia as being centrally located in the design conversation and the craft conversation, and somewhat more, I think his relationship to what's happening in fine art is a little bit more sideways. I think he's camped out on the edges of what's happening in sculpture, and it's really through his public commissions that he's getting the most recognition. So he's not going toe-to-toe with, you know, David Smith and artists of that caliber, and he's not getting involved in the sort of snarling New York avant-garde scene that would be typified by Johns and Rauschenberg either. He doesn't have any very strong connections to pop, although you could maybe see some kinds of similarities between the way that his chair works as a pop icon and the way a Warhol works. He's got none of that ironic, what the British would call piss-taking attitude to the idea of an iconic image. He's just making them. So again, I would compare him most to Calder, who is very similar, you know, singular genius, not easily placed in a category, absolutely beloved, but not really located within the conversation of the avant-garde, which is interesting and instructive to us. I think, you know, maybe this will be my last piece of soapbox commentary. I think that figures like that, who were in a more singular position, that didn't fit into a movement and didn't get digested into the art historical progression from, you know, abstract expressionism to minimalism to conceptualism and on and on. I think figures that stand somewhat outside of that have become much more attractive to us in the 21st century, because we seem a lot less addicted to these kind of linear narratives of art history. So someone like Bertoia, whose main framework of reference, as I said, is in design, looks a lot more interesting from an art historical point of view than he did maybe when I was in graduate school, even in the 1990s, when it was a little hard to figure out how to deal with that. But now I think we have a lot more tolerance for the individual example.
The anomalous.
The anomalous, but you know, in a way, every artist is an anomaly, and it's sort of coming to grips with that fact. I don't know, it's something about living in the age of Google, maybe, gives us more tolerance for the individual example, because we can jump from one thing to another, and we don't need to categorize things in the same way that we used to. And I'm very interested, this is now getting a little far afield, but I'm very interested in the way that art history and design history are now reshaping themselves in much less systematic and orderly ways that actually take account of figures like Bertoia and their unsurpassable individuality. And I think it's great that we're able to come to grips with that uniqueness in a way that perhaps was difficult for us even a generation ago. And that was Mrs. Webb's achievement, was to create the central venue for the celebration of that. I hope everyone heard that, the conjunction of design and craft, the energy of the city, the individual within that. And Webb, by the way, was very interested in individuals and individuality. That was her cause. That, again, was why that's why she used the word craft. Complicated word, often maligned, but it's still today, with all the problems that are associated with that word, very strongly associated with the idea of the individual rather than the factory or the mass. And as you absolutely rightly say, what Bertoia stands for is the ingenious marriage of craft and the machine, the individual hand and the factory, taking the best from both and creating something beautiful, functional, and irrepressibly individual out of that confluence. And so what can I say, Mrs. Webb would have been proud. That's why she put him in our first show. Okay, thanks very much. Thanks.